Dave got his master's degree at the University of Houston, PhD at Rutgers. He then spent some time at the Baruch Institute and the University of South Carolina before coming back to Rutgers in 2003. He is a past president of the National Shellfish Association and became the director of Haskin in 2011 or 2012, something like that. And he's going to talk to us today about managing oysters in Delaware Bay.
Thanks, Eric. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to come down here. As I think I told a couple of you that I was walking around with today, last time I was here I was 15 or 16 years old on family vacation. So it looked a little bit different then. And I don't know if Eric, how many of you know this? I learned today, a couple people didn't know this, the previous director of the Haskin lab was in fact Eric Powell. So I am hopefully doing a good job following in his footsteps. I am going to talk about different aspects of managing oysters in Delaware Bay, mostly talking about the fishery, but then a bit about aquaculture and some other things in there. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there's been a lot of people working on oysters in Delaware Bay, including Eric, prior to me, including Hal Haskin, who the lab's named after. And they've been doing this for a long time. They started studying oysters in New Jersey in 1888. A fellow named Julius Nelson was the state biologist and started looking at how oysters reproduce and documenting them in the coast of New Jersey. This is a shot from behind our lab, and I looked up out, this is where my office window was at one point in time, and saw these two boats out there and thought this is a nice shot to sort of talk about some of the history that's going on here. So in the background you see Delaware Bay oyster schooner. Those were built and put together up the river a couple miles from where the shot is. Many of them were built shallow water draft sailing vessels, specifically designed for the shallow waters of Delaware Bay to dredge oysters up. Around 1950, after 1945, maybe after World War II, diesel engine technology became readily available and inexpensive. They tore the masts off and put pilot houses on, like you see the boat in the foreground here, put an engine in the bottom, and started to put a lot of gear on top of the boat to help process the catches. And so the industry had changed a lot. And those vessels are still operating today. 110 years old, I think, is the oldest vessel that's out there. Wooden vessels still harvesting oysters. So they've been doing this for a long time, and they've actually been pretty successful with some periods of good harvest and bad harvest. So we'll talk a bit about that. Most of you probably know quite well that oysters are sometimes called ecosystem engineers. They build these unique habitats that provide a lot of ecosystem services, such as altering the hydrology around them, filtering the water, capturing sediments, recycling nutrients, sequestering carbon. They protect shorelines in some cases. And of course, they provide a healthy and potentially sustainable, environmentally beneficial food. And I say potentially sustainable because that really depends upon the management strategy, whether or not it's sustainable or not. And beneficial because of all these things that they do for the environment. Because of all those things that they do, it makes management of them kind of complex. And so here are just a lot of the different aspects of management that they have to interact with. And with the fishery at the top, of course, there's a number of different shellfish diseases, and some of those shellfish diseases kill oysters, and some of them are actually dangerous to public health. They're a public health concern. Because they're a good food source and we have the technology to grow them. They're a popular item for aquaculture that's growing pretty rapidly around the country. There's a lot, because of the ecosystem services they provide, there's a lot of effort in restoration and enhancement. Initially, the restoration and enhancement was to support the fishery, but more recently it's to provide ecosystem services. One of those is living shorelines. I think there's a living shorelines program here. Is that correct? That somebody runs. And oysters are often involved in that. And then there's interactions with endangered species in some cases, and I'll just touch briefly on that in a minute. So if you're not familiar with the Delaware Bay, it's sort of a classic funnel-shaped estuarine system. We have the Delaware River coming down from up north across a narrow region in the bottom that opens up into a wider region in the bottom of the bay. And across that we have a pretty extensive set of oyster beds. And they've been divided up this way since the fishery was established, with the upper part of the bay containing what we call the seed beds. And those are natural wild beds. And then in the lower part of the bay they have planted grounds. There were never very many oysters, as far as we can tell, on the planted grounds that occurred there naturally, except in a few areas. And so when we talk about the Delaware Bay fishery, what I'm talking about, I'm mostly talking about these seed beds up here in the upper part of the system. The ones on the, that are not circled there are on the Delaware side of the bay, and so those are managed independently by Delaware, although we do work together with them when we do this. As anywhere that oysters grow, growth, condition, predation, disease, and mortality, those things all increase with salinity. So you get sort of the best flavored oysters down in the lower part of the bay, but they're the most susceptible to predation and disease as well. So you get the highest survival up in the lower salinity areas and lower survival down in the lower parts. We also have some intertidal and subtidal aquaculture that I'll talk about later, occurring in two places in the bay, one right along the shoreline and one a little bit off, about 2 miles out into the bay. But it doesn't constitute at present a very high level of the production that we see, maybe 10% of what the fishery produces. And then the shorelines on both sides of the bay are important foraging habitat for a threatened species of bird called a red knot. I think red knots occur down here. This is one of their overwintering areas. But the larger portion of the population migrates down to South America, and a portion of it also goes all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. They breed up in the Arctic. And so on their spring flight, they stop over in the Delaware Bay for a couple of weeks in May, coincided with the spawning of horseshoe crabs, with the highest concentration of horseshoe crab spawning in the world is in Delaware Bay. So all those sorts of things kind of affect how we manage the oyster population. And when we're talking about the fishery, because we have these oysters that are building this nice habitat, it's used by a lot of organisms, and then we have the fishery harvesting that habitat. So the real challenge is how do we balance these two things out, and that's what managers are trying to do. And of course, if they're doing things in the way that I think is right, they should be taking actions that are based on the scientific information that we can provide them. They know that healthy oyster reefs are going to promote a healthy ecosystem, and that a healthy oyster fishery is also going to promote a very sustainable and stable economy, local economy in there. So that's their sort of challenge in managing the fishery. About, I guess 20 years ago now, some folks in the Chesapeake Bay published this paper in the Journal of Shellfish Research. And in the 90s, at the beginning of the 90s, and maybe in the 80s more, it was managing oysters was all about the fishery. And the ecosystem aspects of it were just starting to become known then. And during the 90s, that recognition grew quite a lot. And it actually put in conflict restoring oysters for harvest versus restoring oysters for improving the environment and the habitat they provide. And in this paper, they argue that those two things are not actually in conflict. They can work together. And they produced this sort of conceptual model here where they said if you have these conditions, you have the right amount of primary productivity in the water, you've got the right kind of a habitat where oysters can grow, the right salinity, the right kind of bottom, all that sort of thing, then oyster reefs can develop. And if oyster reefs develop, then you're going to get all these benefits by restoring the populations, beginning with a sustainable harvest up at the top. And the thing that's missing here is that you actually can't really get a sustainable harvest just because there are oyster reefs there. So I think that arrow is a little bit premature to put in there. And the argument that I make is that they actually need to have a sustainable management program in there if they're going to make this happen. And if they have a sustainable management program in there, then you can restore oyster reefs. And instead of this being the benefits of restoration along this other column, this is the benefits of sustainably managing a fishery in there, is that you can also have the improved water quality while you're harvesting these. You can have habitat for these finfish and benthic inverts and other things. And you can protect other habitats such as salt marshes and things through shoreline protection and whatnot. So restoration doesn't in and of itself create sustainable harvest. Rather, creating a sustainable harvest through sustainable management is the way that you get at successful restoration. So in Delaware Bay, I think it's important to consider what actually happened there, and the story is not unlike we see in other places. So here's a plot of fishery landings, oyster landings rather, in Delaware Bay, and actually in New Jersey, I should say, and how it's declined over time. And you've probably seen many stories like this that look really bad. The fishery, however, has declined, but it's also evolved to remain intact. And we haven't seen the fisheries always evolve in different areas. Sometimes they maintain the same sorts of harvest pressures and things that they do from area. And I think the reason that we've been successful in Delaware Bay is because of how they've changed their management. We're really not harvesting as many oysters as we used to because that was kind of unsustainable. But one of the key things that is a little deceptive in these graphs is that this graph is of landings. So that's what was pulled into the dock. It's not what was out in the bay necessarily. There's a correlation there, of course, but it's not really the abundance of oysters that are out there. The other thing that's in this one is, again, I corrected myself, this is not Delaware Bay landings, it's New Jersey landings. And up until about 1930, this included oysters harvested from New York City all the way down around into Delaware Bay and on up into Wilmington, Delaware. But they pretty much depleted that population by about 1930. And so from 1930 on, it's really just Delaware Bay oysters being harvested in there. Around 1950 or so, the oystermen actually realized that there were problems. They weren't getting as many oysters off the seabeds, and they actually came to the Rutgers lab and asked if they could have some help in managing the resource because they thought it was going to crash. And so in 1953, the lab started doing population surveys of that. Not long after they started that, disease problems started cropping up. The first was MSX, that you are fortunate enough not to have in the Gulf. We'd like to keep it that way. And the second was dermo, which actually was first discovered down here in the Gulf, initially linked to oil drilling, but later identified this was a parasite that was causing mortalities. So those exist, and in fact today, disease is really the major source of mortality in Delaware Bay. And in response to that, though, this is where the evolution of the fishery comes in. The fishery changed from a seed fishery to what we call a direct market fishery. And I actually have to credit Eric for this because this was a shift that he made while he was the director of the laboratory working with the fishery here. And had that shift not been made, I think the Delaware fishery would be gone. So what do I mean by a seed fishery? Here's an example of how this worked before. So we have the Delaware Bay oyster population there, and we have this salinity gradient. It's a little different than the salinities I understand that you have out here, but we get almost down up to ocean water at the mouth of the bay, and fresh water is even ways up, maybe even off of this map. So we're in 5 to 10 parts per thousand at the very lowest end of the distribution of oysters here. So the seed fishery then would harvest small oysters through market-sized oysters from these seed beds, and then they were allowed to plant them on the lower bay. They couldn't take them to market until they were planted in the lower bay. And this did a couple of things. One is it helped the helped managers regulate the fishery a little bit. But it also allowed the oysters to fatten up a bit. Food resources were better. They were generally larger, so they had escaped predators like drills and small crabs and things like that. They were also going to be saltier, so they took on a different kind of a flavor there that was much more preferable back then. And so it took about 6 weeks for that to happen. So then they would market those oysters. They did this during what they called a bay season. And if you come to any of our council meetings, you'll sometimes still hear the oystermen talk about bay season, and some of them have a big fondness for remembering when they were younger, going out with their dads and harvesting boatloads of oysters and bringing them down and planting them, and they'd like to do that again. The regulation of it was 2 to 12 weeks, depending upon the size, the health of the population, or sometimes 0 weeks if they decided that there weren't enough oysters there to harvest. And that decision was something that was established right away when they asked university scientists to come in and help. And Doc Haskin established this 40% rule, which, Eric, maybe you can explain where that came from.
I think he pulled it out of whole cloth. It was a good number.
It was a good number. We have no idea, but it worked. And what it did was it slowed down, and it gave the oystermen an idea of when to stop harvesting, when they were hitting an area too hard. They had a lot of faith in Doc Haskin, and what we would do is the lab would go out and collect a dredge haul, and then just by volume count how many oysters were in there. And if it was less than 40%, they would decide to stop harvesting on that bed. They had to move somewhere else. If there was nowhere else that had more, then they were done for the season. To increase production then, they started importing oysters. And most of these came from Virginia, but from other areas as well. And that allowed them to increase production on here. The reason I show this is because when we're talking about landings now, not all those landings were oysters that originated from Delaware Bay. They may have come from Long Island Sound and been brought down. They may have come from James River in the Chesapeake or somewhere else, been brought through from Maryland in the Seaview canals, and planted on those grounds. And there are documents that indicate sometimes how much was on the barges they were bringing in, but there's also a lot of anecdotal stories about people coming through in the dead of night with some oysters that they got off of somebody's ground they probably shouldn't have been on, and bringing them in and planting them on their grounds. So those landing data are a little bit deceptive in there. This practice can be considered extensive aquaculture. It's an example that we use when we teach our aquaculture class about what that might be. But it was unsustainable eventually because of disease and because of the seed limitations that were available. This is just the aquaculture slide I put in when I teach aquaculture, that it's really a gradient from wild capture fishery to intensive production on this side, and this transplanting operation is somewhere in the middle, where it's low intensity and widespread effort. So we now have the benefit of looking at some of our long-term data, and what you see on this graph, of course on the bottom is you have year. Over on the y-axis on the left side is the number of oysters, the abundance of oysters. And then over here on the right side we see the percent of mortality. And the abundance is the bars, and mortality is the red line. And then I have, really those are just eyeball lines, the gray lines that are coming across, kind of indicating an average level during different periods in there. And you can see that in the 50s, when they came and were asking for help, the population abundance was pretty low. And then there was a big jump in the population, and then it declined again after disease hit. And it was really controlled by the levels of disease that we see in here. So you can see the same lines drawn in here for these disease levels. And when the disease levels are high, the abundance levels are low. We had this sort of glorious period in the 70s into the early 80s when there were just a huge abundance of oysters out there. And the fellows that are boat captains now and running the boats remember that era, because that's how when they were just learning to get out there and harvest it, and they have a great fondness. That's where they think the population should be. But under the disease regime that we're in right now, we don't seem to be able to get the carrying capacity up high enough to make it there. but we're trying. A couple of things that they did, they recognized that one way to get oysters is to plant shell and have them recruit on a clean shell. And in the 60s, there was a massive shell planting program. 1 million bushels of oysters a year easily, sometimes much more than that, were being planted in the bay, both on their leases, but also on the shell, on the seed beds. And on the seed beds was where they hadn't been doing that previously. So the population had gone down, the amount of shell had gone down, so they were just putting lots of shell over there to restore that habitat. And that coincided with the period when the disease dropped. So you had lots of good habitat, low disease, high survival, population jumped way up in response. We had another period where we wanted to replicate that, and Eric actually got a nice large amount of money from the Army Corps to help jumpstart the same thing in around 2004, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Turns out that something else was going on in the population, and we had 5 years of recruitment failures. Never before in the data set did we see 5 consecutive years of recruitment failures. We did get recruitment out of it, just at really low levels. Had we not seen that shell out there to add and collect what we had there, we probably wouldn't have seen the oyster population sustaining itself. So the shell planting program didn't actually increase abundance, but it carried the abundance we had through that period of recruitment failures in there. Okay, so abundance appears to be inversely related to mortality, largely due to disease, and shell planting seems to be a nice way that we can help this. So when we're thinking about managing this disease as a fishery, we're going to look at mortality and recruitment, and we actually want those things to either balance out, or ideally, if we want the population to expand, we need recruitment into the market size to increase. We can't really do a whole lot to control how much mortality happens or how much recruitment we see in the wild population. But we can control how much fishing mortality occurs by controlling the amount of fishing. And we can provide opportunities for recruitment to occur by doing shell plants. And so these are sort of the time series of what's happening over time there, and those are the things that we focus on when we're managing the bay and what we're going to do. It's also critical that we do this in a sort of a collaborative manner with both the regulatory agencies, so the New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife, they run the Bureau of Shell Fisheries. And we also work with the oyster industry and the Shellfish Council. The Shellfish Council is made up of active oystermen appointed by the governor. So they have a vested interest in this. The Fish and Wildlife has a vested interest in it because they're responsible for managing the resource. We don't really have a vested interest in this. We come in as an independent party to help do that. And so we work together, and out pops a fisheries management plan in there. It works kind of like this. It's been doing this cooperative management system since 1953, and it was formalized into a proper peer-reviewed management plan in 1999. And so the Haskin lab monitors the oyster population throughout the year, mostly throughout the warmer parts of the year, the growing season. And in the fall, we end up with a spatially explicit assessment of the population. So we know where the oysters are, how many there are, what mortality happened, what recruitment happened, all that sort of stuff. We present that to a stock assessment review committee at a formal workshop. This just happened last week, actually, or 2 weeks ago. And those folks represent industry, they represent management, and we invite some academics to come and sit on it. And they make recommendations to the council on what their levels of harvest should be, and that then gets ultimately approved by the regulatory agency. So this is a little bit about how that process works. Because we have this long time series of data and it's spatially explicit, we understand a bit about how this resource is structured. And so here is a map that shows everywhere we think that we could find oysters in Delaware Bay. The little empty area down here with the one spot isolated is because there's some leased grounds stuck in there. That was done to help oystermen find areas where they could plant oysters when MSX was a big problem. But we surveyed this entire area. It's about 16,000 acres, goes across 28 miles from top to bottom. And it's divided into 6 management regions here. And management regions are not the same size, but abundances within them are different because you have lower abundances in the lower part of the bay and higher density, not abundances, lower densities in the lower part of the bay and higher densities in the upper part of the bay because of that. So here's sort of how the mortality looks like. So this graph here just shows you each different beds in each of those regions lined up from the top of the graph to the bottom of the graph. So ledge down here at the bottom is this one that's isolated out here, and then Hope Creek, this one all the way at the top. And if we sort of divide these into regions, okay, so VLM stands for very low mortality. These are mortality regions. So it's very low mortality, medium mortality, high mortality. Whoops, sorry. Go backwards. Previous. High mortality. So that's how these are divided up, and then there's one more division that concerns transplants and how we might transplant things. We still have partial transplant fishery in the bay, but it only moves fisheries from the upper portion to the lower portion of this, and then in the lower portion, oysters are removed directly for harvest. And that transplanting allows that upper portion, which is in seasonally restricted waters, to be added to the fishery and harvested and not completely closed to it. When we're done surveying it, we generally find out that oysters don't exist everywhere on the map. There's a lot of empty areas here. And so we categorize each bed within the system. There's 23 beds. We categorize each of them and each sort of grid on here into a high, medium, or low strata related to density on that bed. And that's shown here. So the darker color is the high, and the lighter color is the medium, and all the low ones have been removed. So the low ones represent 2% of the population that's present on a bed. They're removed from the entire analysis, and so they are actually conserved whenever we set quotas. So 2% of the population is removed from being part of the calculation to set a quota. So those are conserved. That's you see how that's important a little bit later. Now the little white dots and the black dots and the crosses show our sampling areas. Actually, this was from 2014. You should have copied the one from this year up there, but it looks very similar to this. And so the management strategies are that we had a change in the harvest control rule in 1996 that went from the bay season to a total allowable catch. This is where that 2% comes in. So when we set the quota, it's a percentage of the abundance. If abundance goes up, the quota goes up. If abundance goes down, the quota goes down. They don't get to harvest the same amount if the population changes. This sort of shows that here. So direct marketing, instead of having to transplant the oysters down to the planted grounds where they're susceptible to disease and mortality now, they aren't surviving down there anymore, they can harvest them directly and market them directly, and it avoids that loss. And then this graph here shows the difference between the numbers of oysters that were harvested during bay season versus the numbers of oysters that get harvested from a direct market fishery. Okay, these are not landings, these are the abundances of the oysters that get removed from the natural population. And so the biomass might be similar in here because there's a lot of small oysters over on this side, and these are all adults over here. Okay, whoops. All right, also key to this is that we have a quantitative survey. If we're just going out there and saying, oh, it's high abundance here, it's low abundance there, that's not going to help us. We actually need to know how many oysters exist on each bed so that we can calculate that and set a total allowable catch. The area management part of it, where we have the different colors on the map that's underneath here, is critical because the quotas are set by area. So if an area is getting fished too hard, that can be closed down separately from the other one. And they can't, if they have a quota of 10,000 bushels, they can't harvest that from anywhere. They're told how many bushels they can harvest from each region. So maybe they can harvest 4,000 from the Lower Bay and the high mortality area, and 3,000 from the medium mortality region, and so on. There's also a rebuilding program built into this through this intermediate transplant and shell planting. So the intermediate transplant helps to rebuild harvested areas, and then we do shell planting throughout. The shell planting program is, I think, still unique in that every bushel that's harvested, the industry pays into their own fund $2 to create a fund that pays for shell planting and these rebuilding programs. So they have a vested interest in maintaining what they're fishing. This sort of is a slide to talk about that shell planting program, and it is the primary tool that we use to enhance the fishery on here. We are fortunate in that just next door to our lab down the street is a major clam processing plant. That's probably, I don't know, depending on how active they are, maybe a couple weeks, if that long, worth of shell on that boat. And they process that year-round from the Atlantic Ocean. So we have that there, and we can use that in our shell planting program. And the industry is planting about 150,000 bushels a year. Now that sounds like an awful lot of shell, but it really covers about 50 acres of those 16,000 acres. Maybe 100 acres. So it's not a lot, and they would like to do 4 to 5 times that much, maybe even 10 times that much if they could, to really increase the abundance. We've gone out and tried to document what kind of impact these programs have on there. So this just shows data from 2018, where we were trying to figure out what was the density on beds that we enhanced versus beds that we didn't enhance. And so you can see that the mean over there on beds that were not enhanced, there's a lot of variability in there, but the mean is around 0. So that's a change in oyster density. So effectively, there was 0 change in oyster density on those beds that were not enhanced in any way with shell plantings or transplants. But we can bump that up, and it looks like this is the average is about an increase of about 30 oysters per square meter, which is not bad, actually. So the shift into the direct market program shows what we've done to stabilize the landings for the industry here. So in the early years, we had to identify how to set the quota and what was right. And so there was a lot of variability from year to year to how heavy they were fishing in different areas. And so what you see is from 1996 to 2006, the first 10 years of this program, there was a lot of variability in landings in there. What we did from that point forward is we confined the fishing pressure into the levels that we had seen they were using and were satisfied with, and restricted it, and it basically stabilized the harvest, and now our rebuilding programs are starting to take off a little bit. So you can see increases in there in the bushels that are being harvested, and this year I think they're going to be around 110 to 120, so they'll be somewhere up where they are right now, maybe a little bit lower this year. So we're plateauing off right now, again, but at a much higher level. Oops. Sorry, clicking this too fast. Right now, we are convinced that we have a stable and a sustainable fishery. The Stock Assessment Review Committee has made that declaration independent from us and independent from the regulatory agency that's done so. The fishing rates, I didn't mention this on one of the graphs there, are only about 2% of the stock. And remember before I said 2% of the stock is taken out of the equation to calculate the fishing. So we're sustaining it because we're not even using that 2% into our equation to set their things. And it's really essential that you have the industry, the regulators, and the researchers working together on this. Survey must be quantitative. The quota has to be hard. It can't be based on per boat with an unlimited number of boats or anything like that. It has to be for the population. That's critical. Area management is also critical so that one area doesn't get hit too hard. Earlier today, when I was meeting over with the aquaculture folks, they were telling me about how a lot of times the oystermen in here in Louisiana might know that the oysters are all right there, and they go and fish that area really hard until there's nothing left, and leave the rest of the area untouched, but there's not really much in the rest of the area. So we spread that out, and rebuilding programs are also critical. So that's the fishery. I want to talk a little bit about aquaculture, because this is where a lot of growth potential and interest and expansion is. We have these big areas of leased grounds that are larger than the areas where the seed beds are, and right now they're virtually unproductive, except for maybe a few guys that keep trying to plant oysters down there. Some years they can harvest, some years everything dies on them. There's two dots on this map. One is on the shoreline, that's in the intertidal area, and the other one's in the middle of the bay in the subtidal area. So it's some 30,000 acres that are leased. The leases, although it says they've been abandoned, they haven't given them up. They're still paying their annual lease fees. It's relatively cheap to keep them, in the hopes that the industry will be revitalized. So we know they think something can be done out there, but it's not clear what they can. And some of these leases, sorry, I have to walk up here. Some of these leases are right along the shoreline. All of these leases here are virtually intertidal. So at low tide, you can just walk out onto them and manage them. And in fact, those were historically used for intertidal culture. And so these were what intertidal oyster racks looked like. And they were putting oyster seed on these racks and letting them fatten up to market. And then they had these for to sell into Cape May, Atlantic City, Philadelphia, wherever. All of that stopped when MSX came in, because we didn't have anything that could resist this disease. So they just completely stopped the practice of it, and it all went away. The game changer that's out there today is that the first thing that Doc Haskin started doing was grabbing anything that survived and breeding it in the lab. He wasn't an oyster breeder by nature, but that's what he decided needed to be done, because that's what he knew his colleagues in the plant biology department and livestock programs were doing with breeding for disease resistance. So he figured, might as well just breed these and do that. And he did that pretty much on his own for many years, until Stan Allen and Shmi Bo came to the labs, and they sort of rescued what had become really highly inbred lines, but with high levels of disease resistance. And those we now have and produce pretty regularly. This has led to the growth and the reestablishment of intensive oyster aquaculture, where we're growing them in racking bags over here. Right now it's pretty small. The potential is really large. There's a lot of challenges. And the primary challenges right now are the regulatory structure that's built around fisheries management, user conflicts with people who don't want to see aquaculture, those sorts of things. And one issue with the endangered species, the red knot, that's not endangered, it's threatened actually, and the conflict with that. So in developing all this, they had to figure out what was the best ways to grow everything. And so they have a couple of different husbandry practices that they had to overcome. One was the fouling that occurs on the bags. So on a daily basis, they're out there with water pumps cleaning mud off of the bags here. And mostly it's from a small worm, Polydora ligni, a little polychaete. It builds these mud tubes all over the racks, and we'll just enclose them in what seems like a day almost. But every week, every bag has to be washed in order to keep that down. And then we actually have winters up there, like you almost experienced yesterday here, I guess. And they have orders and have to figure out how to harvest their oysters out there in the wintertime. And this is like a ritual dance they're doing, I guess, to get to their oysters. One of my colleagues, Russ Babb, who works for the Bureau of Shell Fisheries, put this together out of frustration, to be quite honest, with his bosses that told him that, why can't you get aquaculture started in New Jersey? And he finally sat down and drew this thing to show all the interactions that have to happen with the regulatory areas, agencies for shellfish aquaculture. I think there's 14 different agencies that you have to get some sort of permit or approval from in order to do things, and none of them talk to each other. This is why regulation is a problem, and it's something I think we've cleaned this up a little bit, but we're still working on it a lot. And despite that, we now have more than a dozen companies that are growing oysters in Delaware Bay. Cape May Salts is probably the most famous one. They're the ones that initiated it and really had the drive to make all of this work. But you can go into any of the, I don't know about any of the oyster bars. You can go to a lot of restaurants and oyster bars up in our neck of the woods and find a variety of oysters. And believe it or not, even when they're grown virtually side by side, the flavors are different. I never would have believed that. I would have thought Cape Shore oyster is a Cape Shore oyster, but it's not. I can get, I can take Cape May salt and I can put it next to Betsy's Cape Shore salt, which is maybe less than a mile away, same shoreline, and one of them's real buttery and the other one's much more salty or something. And I'm not exactly sure what's causing the difference in flavors, because even when they get their seed stock from the same source, the flavors are different. There's some sort of husbandry practice that's involved. We started having to produce for the Department of Agriculture an aquaculture report, and so this is, the data is hard to get on an annual basis, so we're always a little bit delayed on who wants to report and who doesn't want to report. It's usually a time thing for the oystermen, but right now we have, I think we have more than 40 licensed oyster farmers in New Jersey now. 19 farms in 2016 reported 2 million oysters sold, $1.37 million. They cannot meet the demand. And I don't know if the same is true down here, but I would imagine that the demand is pretty high down here as well. So things are looking good, and we're trying to get this to increase as much as we can. Started promoting this, and no sooner did it start getting promoted and start to move its way through the legislature did we find out that this bird that's been coming through here for centuries is collapsing, and it happens to feed right where we want to expand these oyster farms. And so this has become a big debate in our area. There's now a stakeholder committee formed with oyster growers on it, and conservationists on it, trying to figure out how to work their way through this, and it's not making progress really fast. There's a PBO that has precautionary measures in it. It's supposed to be based on adaptive management, where new science comes in, and new science has come in, as documented in here, but so far, while the science looks good, and the recommendation is that you can proceed to expand this with caution, the stakeholder committee doesn't seem to be able to say yes to anything in a consensus form. And so far, with I think one exception, no adaptive management protocols have gone through. Well, we have all these offshore leases. Why not move all this out into the offshore leases in there? Why aren't people doing this? So they created the little green square there, is an aquaculture development zone, and they created that to move out there. So far, nobody has leased this. But we have gotten a couple people who own leases already to think about growing oysters out there. This is Cape May Salts. Their vessel, they bought a oyster vessel, and they converted it into a farming vessel. Cost quite a lot of money. This is one of the deterrents for expanding out there, is not everybody can afford to do this. Cape May Oyster Salts is owned by a large fishing company, Atlantic Capes Fisheries, and they were able to do this, and you can see that they have removed the oyster harvesting gear, added a crane on there, and that crane is going to lift cages in and out of the water. They added a lot of gear onto the boat, so they now have a tumbler, a sorting tube on here. These are the cages that they use. The metal in the back there are the big cages, and then these are the trays that sit inside there that hold the oysters in there. And we started working with them to see how well they could produce oysters. The smaller guys can't really do this. They don't have the money to invest in it, so we wanted to find out if smaller gear would work or not. So we worked with a couple of guys that have different designs on smaller cages to see if they can deploy them in different areas. and conducted this study to kind of compare these 3 different methods on here. We're still working on this a little bit, but we've collected most of the data and are looking at how well the oysters are growing, what kind of fouling are they seeing, is there a problem with the way that they manage the oysters, and most critically that the farmers want to know is what are the economic feasibility of the different methods in here. And then we're ultimately going to try and figure out if there are ways we can engage these fellows that own these leases out there to start growing oysters on them through aquaculture methods as opposed to just planting shell that are susceptible to that. We did the study design here. The seed were deployed in 2017. We tended them every other week, just as they would normally. We've done a number of assessments. We actually have one more assessment that's going to go out, come back in as soon as the water temperatures get above 50 degrees. And we've got a little bit of an economic analysis that started, and I'll show you some of those numbers in a minute. This scared the daylights out of us when we saw this. We went out there to sample the first time, and this is what we saw in their cages. Those are mostly tunicates, but a lot of other things on there fouling it. Turns out that this is really not a problem. Enough water gets through there that the oysters grow fine, and fresh water takes care of it in about 30 seconds. So it's not a big deal to get all that much fouling on there. This is why they have to go out there and tend these cages every other week, though. Once they run it, there's the oysters growing inside of there. Even when they're heavily fouled, you can see a lot of live oysters in there. They run them through the tumbler. They start out chock full of mud like this. They come out clean as a whistle. So the product's growing really well. Yeah, that's my bad joke. But they hadn't gone through a winter yet. So this is what we saw happen all summer long in there, and we were afraid of winter. This was winter last year. So this is my aquaculture class. That's Shinguo on the end there, if you know him. And we are standing on top of the intertidal oyster farm. So this is what they had to contend with. This does not happen every year, but it does happen from time to time. When this thaws, we see lots of chunks of ice out there. And this picture is a little deceptive. It looks like that's a pretty small piece of ice, and we're trying to make it look really big. But in fact, these icing are pretty big, and they do a lot of damage to the racks and things that are out there. But the oysters are alive. Mostly what happens is the ice pounds them into the sediments, and they stay just below the sediment. And the key is to get them out of the sediments before things warm up enough that the oysters open up and try and find water. So that turns out to be not as big a problem as we had thought it was going to be. But this is what happened out on the deep water stuff. So first thing is none of the small cages were left. The ice picked up the buoys and carried them somewhere. We went out and did side-scan sonars to try and find them. Couldn't locate a single small cage that we had left out there for the winter time. On the other hand, most of the larger cages like this survived, but there were some problems that some were errors that the company made. So for instance, they started out using a bunch of trays. Eric, remember those thousands of trays stored at the AIC? They had sat in the sunlight for years. And then they started breaking because they were cracking and things, and they went to the same company and bought them, and the company had changed the design so that they were 1/8 of an inch shorter. So instead of these things being tightly bound in there, they were now just enough that they could do this instead of getting shook around in there. So we think we've resolved that one. But the other thing that happened was every now and then the ice could grab onto the buoy and actually lift the cage up and turn it on its side. And even though you see covers on here, in between each nesting, there's a gap. The gap is just wide enough for oysters to slide out. So once it gets flipped up on its side, it's there. So they're working on that one as well. And that's what we're going to test in our next one to see how well that went. So small cages were gone, some of the large cages were damaged, but what did survived quite well. So we have an economist who's trying to help us understand what this kind of costs on here. And these numbers, quite frankly, scared us a lot because we know most of the oystermen can't do this. So these costs are basically based on if you had nothing. Most of the people that we are talking to have some of the gear, they might have a boat already, so some of these costs kind of go away. But there's a substantial difference between trying to do intertidal rack and bag or trying to use one of these large subtidal cages. And he didn't do the intermediate one yet because he thought that was no longer viable. But it actually is viable if you do it within season. So the idea there is that you get your seed, you can grow the seed up to maybe 2 inches. They might not be marketable yet, but you can then sell them to a larger company and they can carry them through the rest of the way. Or if the larger company has an excess of production, they have a lot of 2-inch oysters, you could start with a 2-inch oyster and you could grow it out to market and then sell it from there. And so there's a sort of a niche market that they can do, and we're going to work on that one. But in any case, the point of the slide is that there's an order of magnitude difference in cost almost between intertidal and large subtidal work. But it is possible for folks to get involved in this. So despite winter losses, subtidal aquaculture appears to be viable, has a lot of potential. The performance was comparable to the rack and bag that we're seeing, so you get a good quality product. Although I will say this, that you see up here marketed Elder Point oysters. That's from the company that produces Cape May salt oysters. They took these oysters initially and sold them as Cape May salt oysters, and the buyers recognized the difference in them. They had a different shape and a different flavor. Same seed oyster that they bought, they grew in different places, and they rejected them. They said, these are not Cape May salt oysters. What are you trying to sell us? And they were rejecting. And so they created a new brand. Very clever. And they do have a different flavor. If you like a milder flavor oyster, get the Elder Point. If you like one that's a little stronger, saltier, get the Cape May salts. So we saw that as an advantage, and they did as well. As evidence for the advantage and the success of this, that one boat, they now have 3 boats to do this. So to me, that's an indication that the company believes this is a viable thing, and they're earning money on it. They're going to invest in it to buy 2 more boats. That's a significant investment. Mortality or survival, we're seeing 40 to 60% at 1 year. I already mentioned the subtitle ones, and I just talked about the marketing characteristics. And so I'm going to stop there because we started late and it's only 5 o'clock. So I don't know if anybody has any questions.
Questions?
So you had with a 5-year gap in recruitment, what were the stages that were not, was it like the early stages that weren't recruiting, or was it just
we weren't seeing set on there. So I would say for us that means something that's anywhere from 2 weeks to a month and a half old. That's what we're not sitting.
I'll just have a quick follow-up. Like when you're talking about the high mortality, what are the of all the sources of mortality that you listed? What's the rank order of importance of mortality within your system?
So if we look at the system and plot mortality against the amount of disease we see, so we can have years where there's basically 0 disease, or areas where there's little disease, and areas where there's very high disease, and we look at the background mortality. Background mortality is 5 to 10%, and mortality with disease is 20 to 50%. 20 to 30 on most cases. But it basically, disease doubles the mortality rate that we would see from sedimentation or crabs and all those things combined.
So I know in Maryland and Virginia there was a really big push with with a lot of these local guys who had transitioned into farming to start growing out triploid Asian oysters to replace some of the, at least biomass of the eastern oysters that were dropping off. I'm curious if there was a push at any point for these farming guys just to start growing out some triploid Asian oysters, and if any of that shell was being considered as part of creating more shell layers for spat to set on, for natural spat set.
So, so there was a push to try and figure out if they could grow Asian oysters, triploid ones, and they did work with some farmers to do that, literally under lock and key. They had to put them in cages that had locks on them underwater so that a diver couldn't come down and open up the cage and take them. But ultimately, after about a 10-year period with a full ecological assessment study on there, they decided that this was too risky of a thing to do, and they didn't want to do it. And so all of that stopped. But what it did was it triggered an increased interest in restoring the native oyster. And now there's lots of triploid oysters being grown in the Chesapeake. And how that relates to the shell sort of budget or the resource there, I'm not sure if anybody's looked at that per se, but I would. What's happening is now there's a lot of shell recycling programs going on, so wherever they're shucking the oysters, whether it's at the restaurant or the shucking house, they're trying to collect those and then return those to the bay. So there's probably some sort of impact from that. I don't know what the magnitude of that impact is though. But.
One other question?
So maybe I was misinterpreting, but it seemed like there was kind of a net benefit to putting in seed oysters, like you saw a more of a gain than what you would put in.
In the where I had the two plots of the
Right.
Okay,
right.
so there's a net benefit. I wouldn't say it's more. Yes, it is more than we put in. So what we're counting there is recruitment to there and a change in the abundance on the bed.
Okay.
And so so yes, that change pulls out what if it was a transplant of seed oysters. That change pulls the number of oysters that were added out of that. It also includes just straight shell plants, so with nothing on it.
Okay.
So those two things are mixed together in that green bar on that.
Okay. So did it seem like maybe the live oysters?
There was no difference
between
between, so I didn't
shell
present
and-
that. There's no difference between using live oysters as seed that you put down there versus using shell.
Okay.
Shell was just as effective as transplanting with the live
Okay.
oysters in the data that we have so far. That's a good question.
So one comment, Dave said that the Delaware Bay oystermen are paying for their own shell planting program basically, and that's unique, and he's right about that until last year, I think. And last year, the state of Texas, through their council, imposed a new regulation that requires that all of the oystermen compensate the natural beds by returning a certain fraction of the shell that they're removing in harvest.
So that's a state law?
It's a state requirement, just like the shell taxes in New Jersey.
Yeah.
It's just it's not done exactly as a shell tax. It's done as the oyster company can either return a certain number of bushels per bushel harvested directly, or they can pay an equivalent fee to the state to plant a certain number of bushels. But it's the only other case, and I feel confident it's copied off of the Delaware Bay experience. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.